At first, it appeared to be another palace disagreement, the kind that rarely reaches public attention. Yet behind closed doors, a dispute involving Queen Camilla's family, a priceless royal treasure, and an unexpected intervention from Prince William began raising questions that went far beyond a single piece of jewelry. What was really at stake? For generations, one of the greatest strengths of the British monarchy has been its ability to project continuity, even during periods of uncertainty. Governments change, political storms come and go, and public opinion shifts with remarkable speed. Yet the institution survives by presenting itself as something larger than any individual personality. That image of stability, however, depends on a simple assumption that the rules protecting the crown's history and heritage apply equally to everyone connected to it. And according to a widely circulated claim that has attracted significant attention online, that assumption may have been tested in a dramatic and unexpected way. The story centers on a remarkable royal artifact known as the Sapphire Jubilee Snowflake brooch, a piece reportedly presented to Queen Elizabeth II during celebrations marking her Sapphire Jubilee. According to the account, the brooch was not merely an item of jewelry but a symbol of diplomatic respect and royal continuity, created to commemorate a historic milestone in the late monarch's reign. If that description is accurate, the importance of the piece extends far beyond its financial value. It becomes part of a larger national story, tied to the institution itself rather than to any individual member of the family. And that distinction would soon become critically important. What makes this account particularly intriguing is not the alleged disappearance of the brooch itself but the timing. Following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the royal household entered one of the most significant transitional periods in modern royal history. Residences, collections, archives, and ceremonial assets all required review and reorganization as responsibilities shifted from one reign to another. During such moments, enormous administrative systems are placed under pressure. The question that naturally emerges is whether periods of transition create opportunities that would never exist under normal circumstances. Could something valuable simply slip through the cracks when thousands of items are being cataloged and transferred? According to the narrative, that is exactly what happened. The claim suggests that amid the administrative complexity following the late Queen's passing, the brooch somehow left its official place within the royal collection and ended up in the possession of a member of Queen Camilla's family. Not a senior royal, not an official custodian, not someone entrusted with safeguarding national treasures. A private individual. If true, the implications would immediately raise concerns extending far beyond the artifact itself. How could such a transfer occur? Who authorized it? And perhaps most importantly, who knew about it? Those questions became even more significant when reports within the story suggest that auditors eventually identified a discrepancy during a review of royal holdings. Inventory records allegedly failed to match physical reality. Something was missing. At first glance, that might sound like a routine administrative issue, the sort of bureaucratic problem that occurs in large organizations. Yet history shows that small inconsistencies often lead investigators toward much larger discoveries. The missing object was not an ordinary decorative piece. It was reportedly a state-related gift associated with the crown. Suddenly, what began as an inventory problem appeared to evolve into something far more serious. Then another layer emerged. According to the account, concerns were raised about whether efforts had been made to retroactively legitimize the transfer after questions surfaced regarding the brooch's whereabouts. This is where the story begins, shifting from a discussion about property into a discussion about power. Throughout royal history, influence has often operated through informal relationships as much as through formal authority. Family connections, trusted advisors, and personal loyalties frequently shape decisions behind palace walls. But what happens when those loyalties collide with institutional responsibilities? At what point does protecting a relative become incompatible with protecting the monarchy itself? The story claims that resistance emerged from an unexpected figure, Princess Anne the Princess Royal. Long regarded as one of the hardest-working and most disciplined members of the royal family, and has built a reputation for placing duty above publicity. Unlike some royals who attract constant media attention, the king's sister often operates quietly, focusing on responsibilities rather than headlines. Yet observers have frequently noted that beneath that understated public image lies a figure with considerable influence and deep institutional knowledge. If someone were prepared to challenge a controversial decision involving royal assets, many royal watchers might argue that and would be among the most likely candidates. According to the narrative, the Princess Royal refused to accept explanations she believed conflicted with established principles governing royal collections. Rather than viewing the matter as a private family issue, she allegedly treated it as an institutional concern. That distinction is crucial because it transforms the entire situation. Family disputes can be negotiated. Institutional disputes often cannot. Once questions involve public trust, legal accountability, and the integrity of the crown, the stakes become dramatically higher. And that is where Prince William, the Prince of Wales, reportedly entered the picture. For years, discussions surrounding William's future role as king have focused on one recurring question: what kind of monarch will he become? Will he preserve long-standing traditions exactly as they exist today, or will he push the institution toward a more modern understanding of accountability and governance? Those questions remain subjects of debate among commentators, but according to this account, the alleged dispute surrounding the brooch offered an early glimpse into how the future king might approach difficult choices when family interests and institutional interests appear to collide. What happened next, however, would reportedly transform an internal disagreement into something much larger, forcing decisions that could redefine where authority truly resides within the modern monarchy. And as more details allegedly emerged, it became increasingly clear that this was no longer simply a story about a missing royal treasure. It was becoming a test of principle, loyalty, and the future direction of the crown itself. The developments that followed would raise an even bigger question. When the interests of powerful individuals collide with the interests of the institution, who ultimately prevails? That answer would begin to emerge in ways few observers expected. As the allegations in the story continued to unfold, attention gradually shifted away from the brooch itself and towards something many royal observers considered far more important: the decision-making process inside the institution. After all, valuable objects can be recovered, inventory systems can be corrected, and administrative mistakes can be addressed. What often proves more difficult to repair is public confidence when questions arise about how power is exercised behind palace walls. And according to commentators following the situation, that was where the real significance of the story began to emerge. What made the alleged dispute particularly unusual was that it appeared to expose two very different philosophies operating within the same institution. On one side was the traditional instinct that has shaped royal crisis management for generations, the belief that sensitive family matters should be resolved privately whenever possible. On the other side was a growing emphasis on transparency, accountability, and protecting the monarchy from accusations of favoritism. If those competing approaches were genuinely colliding, then the issue was no longer about a single artifact. It was becoming a debate about what kind of monarchy Britain would see in the decades ahead. Several royal commentators have long argued that the reign of King Charles III represents a transitional chapter rather than a final destination. The monarch inherited an institution shaped by Queen Elizabeth II's extraordinary 70-year reign, yet many believe the future direction of the crown will ultimately be defined by the next generation. That perspective gives additional weight to any situation involving the Prince of Wales. When William makes a decision, observers are often not just evaluating the choice itself, they are searching for clues about how a future king might govern. That is why reports surrounding the alleged intervention attracted such attention among royal watchers. If the future king truly viewed the matter primarily through a legal and institutional lens rather than a family lens, it suggested a significant shift in priorities. Historically, royal households have often sought to avoid public confrontations wherever possible. Yet according to analysts discussing the story, the alleged response appeared to signal that preserving institutional credibility had become the higher priority, even if doing so created discomfort within the family structure. But that interpretation immediately raised another question. If accountability had become the guiding principle, where exactly would that principle stop? Would it apply only in highly visible cases involving state property, or did it reflect a broader philosophy emerging within the next generation of royal leadership? The answer remained unclear, but the uncertainty itself became part of the story. Because once people begin asking whether rules apply equally to everyone, they inevitably begin examining other areas where exceptions may have existed in the past. The reported creation of a new framework for protecting royal assets added another layer to the discussion. On the surface, structural reforms often appear technical and administrative. Most members of the public pay little attention to governance mechanisms, trusts, oversight systems, or custodial arrangements. Yet institutional historians frequently point out that some of the most important shifts in power occur through exactly those mechanisms. Rules determine outcomes long after individual personalities leave the stage. That observation led some analysts to focus less on the immediate dispute and more on the alleged establishment of barriers designed to prevent similar situations in the future. If certain assets were moved into structures insulated from personal influence, then the significance extended well beyond the current controversy. Such a move would effectively reduce the ability of any future figure, regardless of title, to make discretionary decisions involving historically significant property. In other words, the institution would be protecting itself not only from present risks but from future temptations as well. Yet even that interpretation left unanswered questions. Why would such extensive measures be considered necessary in the first place? Institutional reforms rarely emerge in a vacuum. They are often responses to perceived vulnerabilities. And when an institution creates safeguards, observers naturally wonder what concerns motivated those safeguards. Was the alleged dispute simply an isolated incident that exposed a weakness in the system? Or did it reveal broader anxieties inside the royal household about how authority, influence, and responsibility should be balanced moving forward? The role reportedly played by the Princess Royal became increasingly significant in that context. Throughout modern royal history, and has often been viewed as one of the strongest defenders of institutional continuity. Unlike figures whose public identities are closely tied to popularity or media attention, her reputation has largely been built upon consistency and duty. Some royal watchers noted that if and genuinely believed established principles were being challenged, her response would carry considerable weight precisely because she is not typically associated with public campaigns or internal power struggles. That observation led to another fascinating implication. If the king's sister and the heir to the throne were aligned on an issue involving institutional governance, what did that suggest about the broader direction of the monarchy? Individual disagreements occur within every family, including royal ones. Alignment between influential figures, however, often signals something more significant. It suggests shared priorities, shared concerns, perhaps even a shared vision. And that possibility began attracting attention far beyond the immediate controversy. Some commentators observe that the story appeared to touch upon a larger tension that has existed within constitutional monarchies for decades. Modern audiences increasingly expect public institutions to demonstrate fairness, accountability, and transparency. Yet royal institutions also depend upon tradition, discretion, and carefully managed internal relationships. Balancing those expectations has never been simple. Every major decision forces the monarchy to navigate between preserving its historic character and adapting to contemporary standards. What makes this particular story compelling is that it appears to sit directly at that intersection. The alleged recovery of an artifact may have addressed one immediate problem, but it did not eliminate the broader questions emerging around authority and influence. In some ways, those questions became even more important after the immediate issue was resolved. Once observers began discussing who has the power to make certain decisions and who has the authority to challenge those decisions, the conversation naturally expanded beyond a single event. And then another development reportedly drew attention inside royal circles. Rather than focusing on what had already happened, some analysts began asking what future disputes might now look like under this evolving framework. If new precedents were truly being established, future controversies could be handled very differently from those of previous generations. That possibility suggested the story was no longer merely about a disagreement involving one royal asset. It may have been offering an early glimpse into how the monarchy intends to operate during the next era. And if that interpretation proves correct, the most consequential chapter of this story may not be the one that has already unfolded. It may be the one that is only beginning to take shape. As discussion surrounding the alleged controversy continued, a subtle shift began taking place among royal commentators. The focus was no longer centered on whether a particular decision had been made or whether a specific asset had been recovered. Instead, attention increasingly turned towards something far more revealing: what the entire sequence of events appeared to say about the monarchy's internal priorities at a moment when succession planning and institutional modernization are becoming impossible to separate. One reason this attracted such interest is that royal institutions rarely communicate major strategic changes through formal declarations alone. More often, shifts become visible through patterns of behavior. Analysts have frequently noted that the monarchy tends to reveal its future direction gradually through appointments, responsibilities, symbolic appearances, and responses to unexpected challenges. When viewed through that lens, some observers believe the alleged dispute may have been important less because of the immediate controversy and more because of the response it generated. That distinction matters because institutions under pressure often reveal their true priorities when confronted with difficult choices. It is relatively easy to champion accountability when no influential figures are involved. The challenge comes when accountability collides with relationships, loyalties, and established traditions. According to several royal watchers, the significance of a situation lies in the perception that institutional protection appeared to take precedence over personal considerations. Whether one agrees with that interpretation or not, it helps explain why the story generated so much discussion among those who closely follow royal affairs. This may also explain why attention gradually expanded beyond the individuals involved and toward the future structure of the monarchy itself. For years, commentators have debated how the institution will adapt to a world that expects greater transparency from public figures. Modern audiences often judge institutions not by how they perform during ordinary circumstances, but by how they respond when facing uncomfortable situations. The question many analysts began asking was not whether a particular controversy would eventually fade from public discussion. The question was whether the response represented a preview of future governance under the next reign. And that is where a deeper pattern begins to emerge. Throughout modern royal history, moments of transition have often produced tensions between continuity and reform. Every generation inherits traditions it is expected to preserve while simultaneously facing pressures that previous generations never encountered. Queen Elizabeth II spent decades maintaining stability through consistency. King Charles III inherited the responsibility of guiding that legacy into a very different media environment. The Prince of Wales faces yet another challenge, preparing an institution for future decades while preserving public confidence in the present. Some royal commentators have suggested that this balancing act may help explain why seemingly isolated events attract disproportionate attention. Individual controversies come and go, but they can reveal how future leaders think about risk, authority, and responsibility. If a future king is willing to support structural changes that limit discretionary influence, then observers naturally wonder what other reforms may already be under consideration. That possibility transforms the story from an isolated dispute into a glimpse of a broader institutional evolution. Another aspect that attracted attention was timing. Major decisions inside long-standing institutions are rarely made in isolation. Analysts have noted that periods of uncertainty often accelerate conversations that were already taking place privately. In other words, an event may not create a new concern but instead expose concerns that already existed beneath the surface. If that interpretation is correct, then the alleged controversy did not necessarily initiate discussions about governance and accountability. It may simply have brought those discussions into sharper focus. That possibility raises an intriguing question. Were certain reforms already being contemplated before the controversy emerged, with the situation merely providing justification for implementing them more quickly? Some observers believe that could explain the decisiveness reportedly associated with the response. Others argue there is insufficient evidence to draw such conclusions. Yet the fact that the question exists at all demonstrates how much larger the conversation has become. The role of symbolism also deserves attention. Royal institutions communicate through symbols as much as through statements. A photograph, a public appearance, or a ceremonial gesture can sometimes convey messages more effectively than pages of official explanations. Historians frequently point out that monarchy operates within a language of symbolism that audiences instinctively understand, even when no explicit message is delivered. That is one reason why certain public appearances reportedly became subjects of discussion among commentators following the story. The visible presentation of continuity, legitimacy, and succession often carries meanings that extend far beyond the immediate occasion. What makes that particularly interesting is that symbolism works in multiple directions simultaneously. It reassures supporters, signals priorities internally, and communicates expectations for the future. A single public gesture may therefore serve several audiences at once. The public sees continuity. The institution sees authority. Future leaders see responsibility. Understanding that dynamic helps explain why some analysts believe the deeper story is increasingly about succession preparation rather than a dispute over a historical object. And once succession enters the discussion, entirely new questions emerge. How much influence does the next generation already exercise behind the scenes? To what extent are future priorities shaping present decisions? Royal households rarely function according to a simple hierarchy in which authority exists only at the very top. Influence often flows through networks of trust, expertise, and responsibility. Individuals preparing for future leadership roles inevitably become involved in decisions long before they formally assume power. That reality may help explain why some commentators see the situation as part of a broader transition already underway. Not a formal transfer of authority, but a gradual redistribution of influence as responsibilities evolve and future leaders become increasingly central to institutional planning. If that interpretation contains even a measure of truth, then the visible events may represent only one chapter within a much larger story about preparation, adaptation, and long-term strategy. Yet perhaps the most revealing question remains unanswered. If recent developments truly reflect a broader effort to strengthen institutional safeguards, what other areas of royal governance might eventually be affected by the same philosophy? Because once an institution begins prioritizing structures over personalities, accountability over relationships, and permanence over discretion, the consequences rarely remain confined to a single issue. And that possibility leads directly to the uncertainty now attracting the greatest attention among royal observers. The decisions already discussed may not be the final revelation at all. They may simply be the first visible signs of a transformation whose full implications have yet to emerge. If so, everything seen so far could eventually be viewed not as the story itself, but as the opening evidence of a much larger shift taking place inside the monarchy. As the discussion moved beyond individual decisions and toward their consequences, one reality became increasingly difficult for observers to ignore. The various strands of a story, questions about accountability, the apparent strengthening of institutional safeguards, the growing visibility of succession planning, and the perception of shifting influence inside the royal household, were no longer developing independently. They were beginning to converge. What made that convergence particularly significant was that each development appeared to reinforce the others. The more analysts discussed institutional accountability, the more attention shifted toward future leadership. The more conversation focused on future leadership, the more scrutiny fell upon decisions that appeared to reveal how authority might be exercised in the years ahead. And the more those decisions were examined, the more people began asking whether a broader strategic transition was already taking place beneath the surface. That question became increasingly important because institutions rarely change direction through a single dramatic announcement. More often, change becomes visible only when multiple signals begin pointing in the same direction. One isolated decision can be dismissed as circumstance. 2 or 3 related developments may be coincidence. But when a series of actions appear aligned around similar priorities, observers naturally begin searching for a larger explanation. Some royal commentators have argued that this is precisely why the story has continued attracting attention. Not because of its immediate controversy, but because it appears to illuminate broader priorities that may shape the monarchy's future. The emphasis on institutional protection, the apparent preference for formal structures over informal influence, and the growing visibility of figures associated with long-term continuity all seem to point toward a common objective: strengthening the institution before the next major chapter begins. Yet that interpretation introduces its own set of pressures. If the monarchy is indeed moving toward a more structured and accountability-focused model, expectations inevitably rise alongside it. Public expectations rise. Media expectations rise. Internal expectations rise. Once an institution signals that rules matter, people begin paying closer attention to how consistently those rules are applied. Success, therefore, creates a new challenge. The standard established today becomes the standard against which future decisions are judged. That may help explain why some observers believe the consequences of the situation extend far beyond the individuals involved. The real issue is not whether one controversy can be managed successfully. The real issue is whether the response creates obligations that shape future responses as well. In other words, every precedent generates future expectations, and expectations can become powerful forces inside institutions that depend upon public trust. At the same time, another pressure appears to be emerging. For decades, royal leadership has often been viewed through the lens of symbolism and representation. Increasingly, however, commentators are discussing leadership in terms of governance and stewardship. That shift may seem subtle, but it carries significant implications. Governance requires consistency. Stewardship requires long-term planning. Both require decisions that sometimes prioritize institutional interests over personal relationships. Several analysts have noted that this evolving conversation places figures, such as the Prince of Wales, under particularly intense scrutiny. Every decision becomes interpreted not only as a response to current circumstances, but also as evidence of future leadership philosophy. Whether fair or unfair, that is the reality facing heirs to the throne. Their actions are rarely viewed in isolation because audiences instinctively connect present choices to future responsibilities. And that dynamic creates another layer of significance. The more attention shifts toward future leadership, the more every influential figure within the royal household becomes part of a larger conversation about alignment. Who supports which priorities? Who appears most focused on continuity? Who is associated with modernization? Who is viewed as defending institutional tradition? These questions may not always have clear answers, but the fact that people are asking them reveals how far the discussion has expanded from its original starting point. Some royal watchers have pointed out that reactions themselves have become revealing. The relative absence of prolonged public disputes, the emphasis on institutional processes rather than personal commentary, and the apparent focus on governance rather than personality all suggest a deliberate effort to keep attention directed toward the institution rather than the individuals. Whether intentional or not, that approach reinforces the impression that larger considerations are influencing events behind the scenes. What makes this especially interesting is that such an approach can produce contradictory outcomes. On one hand, minimizing personal conflict can reduce public controversy. On the other hand, it can increase curiosity about what discussions may be occurring privately. Silence often resolves one set of questions while creating another. And throughout royal history, unanswered questions have frequently proven more durable than answered ones. As a result, observers increasingly find themselves examining not only decisions but timing. Timing often reveals priorities. Timing reveals urgency. Timing reveals which concerns are considered significant enough to demand immediate attention. When responses appear decisive, analysts naturally ask what pressures may have made delay impossible. What risks were perceived? What consequences were being avoided? What future complications were considered serious enough to justify immediate action? Those questions have gradually shifted the conversation from reaction to anticipation. Because if multiple developments are genuinely converging toward a broader institutional objective, then the next stage becomes critically important. Once structures are strengthened, expectations clarified, and authority increasingly associated with future leadership, a new question emerges. What comes after preparation? Institutions do not prepare indefinitely. At some point, preparation begins producing visible outcomes. That possibility has led some commentators to suggest that the most consequential aspect of the story may not be what has already happened but what it potentially signals. If recent developments represent part of a wider effort to define how the monarchy will operate in the coming decades, then observers may be witnessing only the preliminary phase of a much larger transformation. And that is where the pressure appears to be building most rapidly. The various threads that once seemed separate now point toward a common uncertainty. Questions about accountability lead to questions about governance. Questions about governance lead to questions about leadership. Questions about leadership lead to questions about succession planning. And questions about succession planning inevitably lead to questions about the future direction of the crown itself. What remains unclear is whether these developments merely reflect adaptation to changing circumstances, or whether they signal the emergence of a fundamentally different model of royal authority than the one audiences have become accustomed to over recent decades. If that distinction becomes clearer in the next stage of the story, many of the assumptions guiding the discussion so far may need to be reconsidered entirely. And if that happens, the significance of everything already examined could look very different than it does today. As the larger picture comes into focus, the most important realization may be that the story was never really about a brooch, a directive, or even a dispute involving members of the royal family. Those events may have captured attention, but the deeper significance lies elsewhere. What many royal observers ultimately saw in this situation was a rare glimpse into how the monarchy appears to be preparing for its future, and perhaps more importantly, how that future may differ from the institution people have known for decades. Throughout the story, one theme has surfaced repeatedly without always being stated directly: the growing distinction between the monarchy as a family and the monarchy as an institution. Those two realities have always existed side by side, yet they do not always point in the same direction. Families are built on loyalty, relationships, and personal obligations. Institutions are built on rules, responsibilities, and continuity. Most of the time, those interests overlap. Occasionally, they do not. When they diverge, the decisions made during those moments often reveal more than years of routine public appearances ever could. That is why some analysts believe the lasting importance of the story lies not in any individual action, but in the priorities that appear to emerge from it. The decisions that attracted attention consistently pointed toward the protection of structures rather than personalities, processes rather than preferences, and long-term institutional stability rather than short-term convenience. Whether one views that as modernization, reform, or simple stewardship, it represents a philosophy that carries implications far beyond the immediate controversy. What makes that especially significant is the timing. The monarchy currently exists within a period unlike any other in recent history. The institution is simultaneously honoring a legacy shaped by Queen Elizabeth II, adapting to the reign of King Charles III, and preparing for a future that will eventually belong to the next generation. Few organizations manage three overlapping eras at once. Yet that is precisely the challenge facing the crown today. Some royal commentators have noted that transitions of this scale inevitably force difficult questions to the surface. What traditions remain essential? Which practices require adjustment? How can public trust be maintained in an age where expectations of accountability continue to evolve? And perhaps most importantly, how can continuity be preserved while change is taking place? Viewed through that lens, the developments discussed throughout the story begin to look less like isolated reactions and more like evidence of a broader institutional strategy. The emphasis on governance, oversight, and long-term protection suggests an awareness that future monarchies may be judged differently than those of previous generations. Public confidence increasingly depends not only on symbolism but also on credibility, not only on tradition but also on transparency. That observation may help explain why so many royal watchers paid close attention to what appeared to be a relatively narrow issue. They were not simply evaluating the immediate situation. They were looking for clues about the future culture of the institution itself. Every monarchy evolves. The question is how? Through crisis? Through gradual adaptation? Through deliberate planning? The answer often determines how successfully institutions navigate changing times. Another reason the story resonates is that it touches upon a subject that has always fascinated royal audiences: legacy. Legacy is often discussed in terms of reigns, public achievements, or historical milestones. Yet legacy is also shaped by less visible decisions. The structures leaders leave behind can matter as much as the speeches they deliver or the ceremonies they attend. Historians frequently observe that institutions endure not because individuals are flawless, but because systems are designed to outlast individuals. In that respect, some observers argue that the most consequential aspect of the story may be the apparent focus on strengthening those systems. If that interpretation is correct, then future generations may ultimately view the events differently than contemporary audiences do today. What appears now as a controversy could eventually be remembered as part of a broader period of institutional adjustment, not because of the specific circumstances involved, but because of what those circumstances revealed about evolving priorities inside the monarchy. Yet even that understanding does not answer every question. One of the most interesting aspects of the story is that it leaves room for multiple interpretations. Some observers believe it demonstrates a growing commitment to accountability and institutional resilience. Others argue it reflects the natural tensions that emerge whenever authority, responsibility, and succession overlap. Still others see it primarily as evidence that the monarchy is adapting to modern expectations while attempting to preserve its historic identity. What unites those interpretations is a recognition that the discussion has moved far beyond its original starting point. The audience that began by asking questions about a single event now finds itself considering questions about leadership, stewardship, public trust, and the future shape of the crown. That transformation in perspective may be the clearest indication of why the story has remained compelling. The visible events opened the door. The larger themes kept people watching. And those themes are unlikely to disappear anytime soon. The monarchy will continue facing pressures that previous generations could scarcely have imagined. Media scrutiny moves faster. Public expectations evolve more rapidly. Institutional decisions are analyzed more intensely. Future leaders will need to balance tradition with adaptation while maintaining the continuity that gives the crown its unique role within British public life. That challenge may ultimately define the next era of royal history. Because at its heart, this story appears to ask a question that extends well beyond any single controversy. It asks what kind of institution the monarchy intends to become as it moves through one of the most significant periods of transition in modern times. Will future leadership place greater emphasis on formal accountability? Will governance structures continue to grow in importance? Will public trust increasingly depend upon visible demonstrations of consistency and stewardship? The immediate situation may now seem clearer than it did at the beginning. The broader implications, however, remain very much alive. Perhaps that is why royal observers continue paying attention. Not because they believe one event will determine the future of the monarchy, but because moments like these sometimes reveal larger shifts while those shifts are still taking shape. Years later, historians often look back and identify seemingly modest developments that signal profound transformations already underway. Whether this story ultimately belongs in that category remains uncertain. But it leaves us with a question that may prove more important than any individual detail discussed throughout this analysis. Was this simply a passing royal controversy, or will history eventually remember it as one of the early signs of how the monarchy was preparing itself for a very different future? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the royal family, Prince William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, King Charles III, Princess and the future of the monarchy, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next royal analysis. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you in the next video.